Did you know that in New York, a fire in the heart of an industrial district devoured more than 100 buildings in a single night, plunging the entire city into chaos with no one ever determining what caused it? That in the Adirondack Mountains, entire villages vanished from the map after the timber boom, leaving behind ruins hidden among forests and roads that now lead nowhere. And that for decades, foreign spies mingled among diplomats and businessmen in Manhattan, leaking secrets that sparked international conflicts and court cases impossible to trace. New York is not just Wall Street, musicals, and skyscrapers. It is ambition, espionage, disappearances, silence, and scars that still pulse beneath the asphalt. Get ready, because today you'll discover 33 real, incredible, and chilling stories from New York that will completely change the way you see the most restless heart of the United States. 33. The Ghost Ship of the Hudson River. Deep within the misty reaches of the Hudson River, a spectral vessel is said to glide silently through the fog, mirroring the ill-fated final voyage of Henry Hudson himself. This ghostly ship, often identified as the Half Moon, appears to sailors and shoreline dwellers alike during the peak of summer storms. Legend says that Hudson and his crew, cast adrift by a mutinous company in the far north, never truly left the waters they claimed for the Dutch. Witnesses describe a shimmering 17th century carrack that vanishes into thin air just as it seems destined to collide with modern vessels. While skeptics dismiss these sightings as mere atmospheric reflections or tricks of light on a rainy evening, the persistent reports over centuries suggest a lingering spirit of exploration. It is a chilling reminder of the high stakes and treacherous hearts that once charted the wild edges of this great American empire. 32. The peculiar origin of the baker's dozen. In the bustling streets of Old Albany, a baker named Bos Volkert Jan Peterson van Amsterdam once lived by a very strict and stingy code. One evening, an old woman entered his shop and demanded 13 cookies for the price of 12, claiming it was her right. When Bos refused her, she cursed his business, and suddenly his dough would not rise and his cakes turned to stone. Desperate to save his livelihood, he eventually relented when the woman returned, offering 13 items for every dozen sold. This superstitious practice spread throughout the colony of New York and eventually the world, giving us the 13 count we still recognize today. It serves as a delicious reminder that sometimes being a bit more generous than required is the only way to keep the spirits happy and the ovens hot in the unpredictable world of colonial commerce. 31. The day Niagara Falls ran dry. In late March of 1848, the thunderous roar of Niagara Falls suddenly vanished, replaced by an eerie and terrifying silence that woke the local residents from their sleep. High winds had pushed a massive field of lake ice into the mouth of the Niagara River, creating an accidental dam that completely choked off the water flow. For 30 hours, the Great Falls were reduced to a mere trickle, revealing the jagged rocks and discarded artifacts of centuries on the riverbed. People walked out onto the dry limestone, picking up bayonets from the War of 1812 and strange geological specimens. Many believed it was the end of the world, gathering in churches to pray for the return of the waters. When the ice dam finally broke, a wall of water returned with a deafening crash, restoring the natural wonder to its former terrifying glory. Before continuing, be sure to subscribe and leave a like to keep discovering the strange and incredible history of our entire country. 30. The Brooklyn Bridge Stampede of 1883. Shortly after the Brooklyn Bridge opened as the eighth wonder of the world, a simple trip across the East River turned into a scene of absolute carnage. On Memorial Day, a woman tripped while descending the stairs on the bridge's narrow pedestrian promenade, sparking a sudden and irrational panic among the holiday crowds. A rumor swept through the thousands of walkers that the massive suspension bridge was about to collapse into the icy waters below. In the ensuing rush to escape, 12 people were trampled to death, and scores more were injured as the crowd pressed against the iron railings. To prove the bridge was actually safe and sturdy, the famous showman Phineas Taylor Barnum later marched 21 elephants across the span. This grand parade of pachyderms finally convinced the terrified public that the stone towers and steel cables were capable of holding the weight of their fears. 29. The Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894. At the end of the 19th century, New York City faced an environmental disaster that seemed impossible to solve. With over 100,000 horses working the streets, the city was being buried under massive mounds of manure that reached 60 feet high in some vacant lots. Experts at an international urban planning conference predicted that by the middle of the 20th century, every street would be buried under 9 feet of waste. The stench was unbearable, and the fly population was creating a public health nightmare that threatened to choke the metropolis. loss. This crisis was only averted by the rapid and unexpected development of the horseless carriage, which replaced the equine workers with internal combustion engines. It is a classic example of how a problem that seems destined to destroy a city can be rendered obsolete by a sudden leap in technology that nobody saw coming. 28. The legend of the alligators in the sewers. For decades, stories have circulated about giant alligators prowling the dark, damp tunnels of the New York City sewer system. This urban legend allegedly began in the 1930s when families returning from Florida vacations supposedly brought baby alligators home as pets, only to flush them down the toilet when they became too aggressive. While most scientists dismiss the idea of a self-sustaining underground population due to the freezing winters and toxic environment, there is a kernel of truth to the tale. In February of 1935, a group of teenagers actually found an 8-foot alligator struggling in a snow-clogged manhole in East Harlem. They used their shovels to dispatch the creature, proving that at least once the nightmare was real. Since then, the myth has grown into a symbolic representation of the hidden and dangerous secrets that lurk beneath the feet of every unsuspecting city dweller. 27. The Whispering Gallery of Grand Central Terminal. Hidden in plain sight within the magnificent architecture of Grand Central Terminal lies a physical anomaly that seems more like magic than engineering. In the dining concourse near the entrance to the famous oyster bar, 4 low arches create a perfect acoustic chamber known as the Whispering Gallery. Because of the way the arches are curved and tiled, 2 people can stand at opposite diagonal corners and whisper softly into the wall, hearing each other's voices as clearly as if they were standing side by side. Legends say that jazz musicians and star-crossed lovers have used this secret spot for decades to pass messages without being overheard by the bustling crowds. It is a rare moment of intimacy in a station that sees hundreds of thousands of commuters every day, proving that even in the loudest city on earth, there are places where a whisper carries further than a shout. 26. The Hermit of Niagara Falls. In the 1820s, a young and wealthy Englishman named Francis Abbott arrived at Niagara Falls and became so enchanted by the cataracts that he never left. He moved into a small hut on Goat Island, right at the edge of the rushing rapids, and lived a life of total solitude. Abbott was often seen performing terrifying feats of balance, such as walking out onto a single timber that projected over the abyss of the falls. He spoke to no one, spending his days playing a flute and wandering the cliffs in a trance-like state. Locals regarded him with a mix of awe and pity, calling him the Hermit of the Falls. His story ended tragically in 1831 when he drowned while bathing in the river. To this day, some visitors claim to hear the faint sound of a flute drifting through the mist near the Bridal Veil Falls. 25. The Man Who Sold the Brooklyn Bridge. George C. Parker was perhaps the most audacious con artist in the history of New York, making a career out of selling landmarks to unsuspecting tourists. His favorite target was the Brooklyn Bridge, which he claimed to sell at least twice a week for several decades. Parker would set up fake real estate offices and produce convincing forged documents to prove he owned the span. He would convince immigrants and out-of-towners that they could make a fortune by setting up toll booths on the bridge. The police frequently had to stop the new owners from trying to erect barriers to collect fees from angry commuters. Parker eventually moved on to selling the Statue of Liberty in Madison Square Garden before he was finally caught and sentenced to life in prison. His exploits gave birth to the famous phrase used to mock the gullible, "If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you." 24. The real inspiration for Sleepy Hollow. While Washington Irving's tale of the Headless Horseman is a work of fiction, it was deeply rooted in the very real and bloody history of the Hudson Valley. During the American Revolution, the area around Tarrytown was a lawless neutral ground where British and American marauders frequently clashed. The legend of the horseman was inspired by a real Hessian soldier who lost his head to an American cannonball during the Battle of White Plains in 1776. Locals later buried the decapitated body in the cemetery of the Old Dutch Church in Sleepy Hollow. Another local figure, a woman named Hulda the Witch, was an immigrant from Bohemia who lived in the woods and was feared by the community until she died bravely fighting off British soldiers. Irving blended these historical shadows into a story that has haunted the American imagination for over 2 centuries, turning a quiet village into a permanent home for the supernatural. And 23, the frozen Niagara Falls of 1911. Every few decades, the winter in New York becomes so brutally cold that even the mighty Niagara Falls appears to freeze solid. The most famous instance occurred in the winter of 1911 when a massive ice bridge formed across the base of the falls, connecting the United States and Canada. The ice became so thick that people actually built small shacks on top of the river to sell photographs and hot chocolate to adventurous tourists. People would slide down the frozen mounds of spray, known as ice volcanoes, which grew to be nearly 100 feet tall. It was a surreal winter wonderland where the roar of the water was muffled by a thick armor of white. However, the practice of walking on the ice bridge was permanently banned in 1912 after a sudden break in the ice sent several people drifting toward the lower rapids, reminding everyone that nature's beauty is often a mask for its danger. 22. The immortal vessel of the World's Fair. In the year 1939, as the world teetered on the brink of a terrible global conflict, the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company decided to bury a message for the far distant future. They created a sleek bullet-shaped capsule made of a special copper and chromium alloy called cupalloy, designed to withstand the crushing weight of time for 5,000 years. Inside this metallic shell, they placed a collection of everyday items meant to represent the peak of human civilization, including a pack of cigarettes, a fountain pen, and a microscopic film containing millions of words and images. They even included a small-scale model of a grocery store and a woman's hat. This silent sentinel remains buried 50 feet beneath Flushing Meadows Park in Queens, not to be disturbed until the year 6939. It serves as a poignant time-traveling letter, reminding those future citizens that once we were a people filled with hope, ingenuity, and a strange fondness for felt hats. 21. The Haunted Octagon of Blackwell's Island. Standing tall on what is now known as Roosevelt Island is a bizarre architectural wonder called the Octagon. Originally built in 1839 as the grand entrance to the New York City Lunatic Asylum, this stone structure was intended to be a place of healing, but quickly became a site of absolute horror. The conditions inside were so wretched that the famous journalist Elizabeth Cochran Seaman, writing under the name Nellie Bly, feigned insanity just to get inside and expose the truth. She described a world of freezing baths, spoiled food, and brutal treatment by the staff. The Octagon itself featured a magnificent spiral staircase that seemed to climb toward a heaven that the inmates would never see. Today, the building has been converted into luxury apartments, but some residents claim that the air in the hallways still feels unnaturally cold and heavy, as if the ghosts of the forgotten and the mistreated are still wandering the circular corridors. 20. The forbidden isolation of North Brother Island. Between the Bronx and Queens lies a small, overgrown patch of land called North Brother Island that is strictly off limits to the public. For decades, this island served as a quarantine camp for those suffering from the most infectious and feared diseases of the age. Its most famous resident was Mary Mallon, better known to history as Typhoid Mary, who was forcibly confined there for decades because she was a healthy carrier of typhoid fever. She lived out her final years in a small cottage, looking across the water at the city she could never return to. The island was also the site of the horrific General Slocum steamship disaster, where over 1,000 people perished in a fire, with many bodies washing up on the island's rocky shores. Today, the hospitals and laboratories are crumbling ruins swallowed by thick vines and trees, creating a silent green kingdom for birds and the lingering memories of a city's darkest medical fears. 19. The Great Cardiff Giant Deception. In the autumn of 1869, workers digging a well on a farm in Cardiff, New York, made a discovery that paralyzed the nation: a 10-foot-tall petrified human giant. People flocked from all over the country to see the biblical wonder, paying 50 cents a head to marvel at the stone muscles and toes of the ancient colossus. Even some scientists and clergymen proclaimed it was a genuine fossilized man from a lost era. However, the whole affair was an elaborate prank orchestrated by a man named George Hull, who had carved the giant out of a massive block of gypsum in Iowa before burying it in New York. The hoax was so successful that Phineas Taylor Barnum offered $60,000 to buy it. When Hull refused, Barnum simply built his own fake giant and told the public that the original was the fraud. It was a spectacular lesson in how easily a good story can conquer the truth. 18. The Grand Wedding of the Waters. When the Erie Canal was finally completed in 1825, it changed the destiny of New York forever by connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. To celebrate this feat of engineering, Governor DeWitt Clinton embarked on a grand naval parade from Buffalo all the way to New York City. He carried with him 2 wooden kegs filled with water from Lake Erie, which he intended to pour into the salty brine of the Atlantic. This ceremony, known as the Wedding of the Waters, symbolized the marriage between the wild interior of the continent and the global commerce of the sea. As the fresh water hit the salt water, cannons fired in a synchronized line from Albany to the harbor, acting as a primitive telegraph to announce the news. This connection turned a sleepy port town into the economic engine of the world, proving that a simple ditch could reshape the very geography of human ambition. 17. The night the lights died in 77. On a humid July evening in 1977, a series of lightning strikes hit key power lines, plunging almost all of New York City into a terrifying total darkness. Unlike a previous blackout in 1965, this event triggered a wave of chaos and looting that saw over 1,600 stores damaged and thousands of fires set across the 5 boroughs. The city was already struggling with a financial crisis, and the fear of a serial killer and the sudden loss of power acted like a match to a powder keg. Interestingly, some historians believe this dark night helped spark the birth of hip-hop culture, as many young residents looted expensive DJ equipment and sound systems that they otherwise could never have afforded. When the lights finally flickered back on 25 hours later, the city was forever changed, having looked into the abyss of its own social fragility under the cover of a moonless sky. 16. The tragedy of Topsy the elephant. In the early years of the 20th century, Coney Island was a place of wild spectacle and often cruel entertainment. One of its most famous residents was Topsy, a captive circus elephant who had been mistreated for years and eventually turned aggressive toward her handlers. In 1903, her owners decided to execute her in a public display at Luna Park. Thomas Edison, who was embroiled in a fierce battle over the future of electrical power, saw an opportunity to demonstrate the supposed dangers of alternating current. He assisted in the execution by using a high-voltage system to electrocute the poor animal in front of a crowd of thousands. The event was filmed and became one of the first viral videos in history, though it remains a somber and heartbreaking chapter in the story of New York's amusement parks. It stands as a grim reminder of the price paid by nature in the pursuit of industrial progress and cheap thrills. 15. The unsolved blast on Wall Street. On a warm September afternoon in 1920, a horse-drawn wagon carrying hundreds of pounds of dynamite and heavy iron weights came to a halt in front of the assay office on Wall Street. Seconds later, a massive explosion tore through the financial district, shattering windows for blocks and sending shrapnel flying through the air. 38 people were killed and hundreds were injured in what was then the deadliest act of terrorism on American soil. Despite a massive investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other agencies, the culprits were never found, though many suspected Italian anarchists were responsible for the carnage. If you walk past the corner of Wall and Broad Streets today, you can still see the deep pockmarks and scars in the stone walls of the House of Morgan building. These indentations remain as a silent physical record of a day when the heart of American capitalism was shaken to its very foundation. 14. The fire that forged a safer city. In March of 1911, a small fire broke out on the upper floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory near Washington Square Park. Within minutes, the workspace became a death trap for the young immigrant women working there because the exit doors had been locked by the owners to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. With the fire escapes collapsing and no way to flee, 146 workers perished, many jumping from the windows in front of horrified onlookers. This tragedy shocked the conscience of the nation and led to a massive overhaul of labor laws and fire safety regulations. The horrifying sight of the victims sparked a revolution in the workplace, eventually leading to the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the modern labor movement. It is a story of how a singular, terrible moment of negligence forced a city and a country to finally value the lives of its hardest workers. 13. The bomber in the Empire State Building. On a foggy Saturday morning in July of 1945, a Mitchell Bomber 25 of the United States Army Air Forces was flying toward Newark Airport when the pilot became hopelessly disoriented in the thick clouds. The plane crashed directly into the 79th floor of the Empire State Building, which was then the tallest structure in the world. The impact ripped a massive hole in the limestone and sent burning fuel down the elevator shafts, killing 14 people. In an incredible twist of fate, an elevator operator named Betty Lou Oliver however, survived a 75-story plunge when the cables of her car were severed by the crash. She holds the world record for the longest survived elevator fall in history. Despite the massive damage and the tragedy of the lives lost, the building remained structurally sound and actually opened for business on the very next Monday, showcasing the incredible resilience of New York's steel and spirit. 12. The secret subway of Alfred Ely Beach. Long before the massive subway system we know today was even a dream, an inventor named Alfred Ely Beach decided to build his own secret transit line under Broadway. In 1870, tired of the corrupt political machine of William Marcy Tweed, Beach built a one-block-long tunnel in total secrecy, working only at night and hauling dirt away in muffled wagons. His train was a luxurious wood-paneled car that was pushed through the tunnel by a giant pneumatic fan, like a letter in a mail tube. For a small fee, New Yorkers could descend into a lavishly decorated station, complete with a grandfather clock and a goldfish pond to take a ride on the future of transportation. Though the project was eventually shut down due to political opposition and financial panic, it proved that the city could exist beneath the streets. The station was rediscovered decades later by workers building the modern subway, a ghost of an underground Victorian paradise. 11. The disappearance of Dorothy Arnold. Dorothy Arnold was a wealthy socialite and an aspiring writer who vanished into thin air on a crisp December afternoon in 1910. She had spent the day shopping for a new dress on Fifth Avenue, carrying nothing but a few dollars and a book of essays. Witnesses last saw her walking towards Central Park looking healthy and vibrant, but she never returned to her family's opulent mansion. The search for the heiress became a national obsession, with rumors ranging from secret elopements to mysterious hospitals. Her father spent a fortune on private investigators, yet not a single trace of her was ever found. Her disappearance remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of the city, a haunting reminder that even in a crowded metropolis of millions, a person can simply step into the shadows and disappear forever without leaving a single footprint. Before moving on to story number 10, remember to subscribe and like to become an expert on the history of our wonderful country. 10. The Great Blizzard of 1888. It was a storm that stopped the heart of a giant. In March of 1888, a massive blizzard dumped over 4 feet of snow on the city, with drifts reaching the second floors of buildings. The wind was so fierce that it blew people off their feet, and the telegraph lines snapped under the weight of the ice, cutting off communication with the outside world. Hundreds of people died in the freezing cold, and the entire city ground to a complete halt for days. This natural disaster eventually forced the city's leaders to realize that the overhead wires and steam trains were too vulnerable to the elements. As a direct result, they began planning the underground subway and electrical systems we use today. It was a brutal reminder from Mother Nature that despite all of our human engineering, we are still subject to the whims of the winter sky. 9. The General Slocum Disaster. On a sunny morning in June of 1904, a paddle-wheeled steamboat called the General Slocum caught fire while carrying over 1,000 members of a local church on an annual picnic. The tragedy was compounded by a series of horrific failures. The lifeboats were tied down with wire, the life jackets were filled with rotten cork that had turned into dust, and the fire hoses crumbled when used. Over 1,000 people, mostly women and children, perished in the waters of the East River. This remains the deadliest civilian disaster in the city's history prior to the events of September 11th. The shock of the loss decimated the vibrant German community of the Lower East Side, causing it to disperse and vanish almost overnight. It is a somber tale of how negligence can turn a day of celebration into a generational scar on a city's soul. 8. The Unisphere and the 1964 World's Fair. In the heart of Flushing Meadows, there stands a massive 12-story high steel globe that remains one of the most recognizable landmarks in Queens. This is the Unisphere, built as the centerpiece for the 1964 World's Fair to symbolize world peace through understanding. It was designed to look like a giant skeleton of the Earth, featuring 3 large rings that represent the paths of early satellites, including the first human to orbit the planet. During the fair, it was surrounded by a beautiful reflecting pool and hundreds of jumping fountains that made the entire structure appear as if it were floating in space. While the fair itself eventually closed and many buildings were demolished, the Unisphere remains a testament to the mid-century optimism of the space age. It stands as a frozen dream of a future where all nations might finally work together under a single, united sky. 7. George Willig, the Human Fly. In May of 1977, a young mountain climber named George Willig decided to take on the ultimate urban challenge by scaling the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Using a set of custom-made metal clamps that fit into the window washing tracks, he spent 3.5 hours climbing the vertical steel skin of the building. Thousands of people gathered on the streets below, watching in stunned silence as he moved slowly toward the clouds. When he finally reached the roof, he was greeted by police officers who promptly arrested him. The city initially intended to sue him for a massive amount of money, but the public's admiration for his feat was so great that the mayor eventually settled for a fine of just 1 cent for each floor he climbed. His daring ascent remains a legendary example of the individual human spirit's desire to conquer the impossible concrete peaks. 6. The hidden apartment in the New York Public Library. Few people realize that the majestic main branch of the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue was once a permanent home for a family. Deep inside the building, there was a secret apartment intended for the superintendent who managed the massive coal furnaces and complex electrical systems. For 30 years, John Fetteler and his family lived in an 8-room residence tucked away behind the marble walls, raising children amidst millions of books and silent hallways. The children often played in the grand reading rooms after the public had left, treated to the world's most impressive private library. Eventually, the coal furnaces were modernized and the need for a live-in caretaker vanished, leading to the apartment being converted into offices. It remains a charming piece of city lore, imagining a life where the most famous library on earth served as a cozy backyard for a family of book-loving residents. 5. The Little Red Lighthouse. Tucked beneath the massive shadow of the George Washington Bridge sits a tiny, bright red lighthouse that once guided ships through the treacherous waters of the Hudson River. Built in the late 19th century, it was originally used to warn sailors away from the rocky point of Jeffrey's Hook. However, when the colossal bridge was completed in 1931, its massive lights made the small lighthouse obsolete. The city planned to demolish the structure and sell it for scrap, but the public protested with such passion that the little building was saved. It was immortalized in a famous children's book that told the story of a small thing finding its place in a world dominated by giants. Today, it stands as a symbol of resilience and local pride, proving that even a small, outdated landmark can hold a giant place in the hearts of the people who live in its shadow. 4. The Stonewall Uprising. In the early morning hours of late June in 1969, a police raid on a small bar in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall Inn sparked a revolution that would change the world forever. At the time, it was illegal for members of the gay and transgender community to gather in public or even dance together. Weary of constant harassment and humiliation, the patrons of the bar decided to fight back, leading to 6 days of protests and clashes in the streets of the village. This event is widely considered the birth of the modern movement for equal rights for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. It transformed a hidden subculture into a powerful political and social force that demanded dignity and justice. Today, the site is a national monument, standing as a testament to the bravery of those who stood their ground against the weight of an unfair and oppressive law. 3. The Statue of Liberty's crowdsourced pedestal. When the Statue of Liberty arrived from France in several hundred crates, the United States of America faced a major problem. There was no money to build the massive stone pedestal she was supposed to stand on. The government refused to pay for it, and wealthy donors were uninterested in the project. That was when Joseph Pulitzer, the publisher of the New York World newspaper, launched one of the first successful crowdfunding campaigns in history. He promised to print the name of every single donor in his paper, no matter how small the amount. Over 120,000 people responded, many of them schoolchildren and working-class families who sent in pennies and nickels. Within 5 months, the money was raised, and the lady in the harbor finally had a place to rest her feet. It remains a powerful story of how the people, rather than the politicians, built a symbol of freedom. 2. The Sheep of Sheep Meadow. If you walk through the lush green expanse of Sheep Meadow in Central Park today, you will see people sunbathing and playing frisbee, but for nearly 80 years, you would have seen actual sheep. Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, the designers of the park, believed that grazing animals added a sense of pastoral beauty and tranquility to the urban environment. A flock of nearly 200 Southdown sheep lived in a nearby building called the Sheepfold and was brought out daily to graze on the grass, effectively acting as the city's most adorable lawnmowers. stores. The sheep became a popular attraction for city dwellers who had never seen livestock up close. However, during the Great Depression, city officials feared that hungry residents might hunt the sheep for food, so the flock was moved to a park in Brooklyn and eventually to a farm in the countryside. The name of the meadow remains a quiet tribute. 1. The purchase of Manhattan. The most famous real estate deal in history is often described as a simple transaction where the Dutch bought Manhattan from the Native Americans for $24 worth of beads and trinkets. However, the reality is much more complex and fascinating than the myth. The Lenape people, who lived on the island, did not believe in the concept of permanent land ownership. They viewed the trade as a gesture of friendship and an agreement to share the land's resources. Furthermore, the goods traded were actually high-value items like metal kettles, axes, and cloth, which were worth far more to the Lenape than shiny beads. The famous $24 figure was actually a 19th century calculation that failed to account for the true economic value of the items. This legendary sale was not a simple swindle, but a profound cultural misunderstanding that laid the groundwork for the creation of the greatest city on the face of the earth. After watching these 33 stories about New York, tell us, did you know any of them? Which one did you like best? Or which one surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. Let's see how many of us share the same story, and if you think we've missed something or want to add something, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps us improve each video. Also, if you noticed any pronunciation mistakes, thank you for your patience. We strive to improve with every video. And speaking of videos, there's another one playing right now so you can continue exploring the history of our beautiful country. But before you go, don't forget to subscribe and like so we can keep learning together. See you in the next one.